Katherine, you really need to get your life together. We can't keep supporting you forever, my mother said, pouring champagne for everyone at the table except me, and I felt that familiar sting in my chest as my siblings nodded in agreement, unaware that the mortgage payment I'd made 3 days earlier was the only reason we still had a roof over our heads to celebrate Thanksgiving in. I was 42 years old, working as a procurement manager for a medical supply company, but to my family, I was the eternal disappointment who never married, never had kids, and lived in what they assumed was a cramped studio apartment on the wrong side of town. They loved to remind me how my younger sister Lisa had married a surgeon, how my brother Michael owned 3 car dealerships, how even my cousin Jennifer, who'd been arrested twice in college, now lived in a gated community with her investment banker husband. What they didn't know was that my pathetic job had evolved over the years into something much more substantial, that I'd been promoted 4 times and now managed contracts worth millions. But I'd learned long ago that sharing good news with my family only led to requests for loans that would never be repaid, so I kept quiet and let them believe their narrative. Every family gathering followed the same script. With me sitting at the far end of the table, drinking water while they enjoyed wine, I knew cost more than they claimed to spend on groceries, listening to their vacation plans and their children's achievements, their renovations and their new cars, while they occasionally threw pitying glances my way and made suggestions about night school or online dating sites for women my age. The irony was that while they discussed their financial struggles in hushed tones, thinking I couldn't hear, I was mentally calculating which bills I'd need to cover that month, the property taxes due in December, the insurance premiums they'd forgotten about, the maintenance fees for the house they believed my deceased father had paid off years before his death. They never questioned why the lights stayed on when they forgot to pay the electric bill, why the internet never got disconnected despite the warnings, why the house repairs happened without anyone calling a contractor, and I let them live in their bubble because confronting them would mean admitting how long I'd been their silent safety net. The pattern had started 20 years ago when Dad died and left me as executor of his estate, a detail my family conveniently forgot whenever they told the story of how they'd heroically managed to keep the family home. But I remembered sitting in that lawyer's office at 22, learning about reverse mortgages and property taxes, while my siblings planned the funeral flowers and argued over who'd get his watch. My mother developed selective amnesia about my contributions, telling her church friends how her successful children supported her, while her eldest just couldn't seem to find her way. And I'd bite my tongue during those conversations, thinking about the $3,200 I'd transferred that morning to cover her medical bills, the insurance premiums I'd been handling since Dad's policy lapsed, the credit card debts she'd accumulated buying gifts for grandchildren who barely knew my name. Every achievement I shared became ammunition for their narrative of my inadequacy, like when I mentioned my promotion to senior manager, and Michael laughed, saying corporate titles were just participation trophies for people who couldn't build real businesses, or when I bought a reliable car, and Lisa commented that at least it was practical since I didn't have a family to transport, never knowing I could have afforded the luxury SUV she leased, but chose to keep my money flowing toward their necessities instead. The exclusions started small, forgotten invitations to casual dinners that I'd hear about later through photos on social media, then escalated to missed birthdays and holidays I'd learn about through cousin Jennifer's Instagram stories, always with the excuse that they thought I was working or that it was just family, as if I existed in some parallel category, not quite family enough to include, but family enough to expect support from. They'd perfected the art of discussing their struggles within earshot, knowing I'd quietly handle whatever crisis emerged, from Michael's dealership hitting rough patches, to Lisa's husband's gambling debts, to Mom's shopping addiction, and I'd watch them perform financial distress while wearing designer clothes and planning renovations, their poverty theater designed to trigger my guilt and my checkbook. What hurt most wasn't the money but the erasure, how they'd rewrite history at every gathering, telling stories about family vacations I'd paid for as if I hadn't been there, discussing the house improvements as Michael's genius investments when I'd hired every contractor, planning holiday menus around everyone's preferences except mine because I probably wouldn't make it anyway, even though I'd never missed one, not once in 20 years, sitting at that same spot at the table, invisible but essential, like a piece of furniture that paid bills. The breaking point came on a humid Thursday evening in September, when I arrived at the house to drop off groceries I knew Mom needed but wouldn't ask for, and found my entire family gathered in the living room, with a stranger in a suit, discussing estate planning and the future of the family home. A meeting no one had bothered to mention to me despite my name being on every check that kept that house standing. "Oh, Katherine, we didn't think you'd be interested in this financial stuff," Lisa said with that dismissive wave I'd seen 1,000 times, while the lawyer shuffled papers that detailed asset distribution and inheritance plans, and I stood there holding grocery bags worth $200, feeling like a delivery person who'd stumbled into a private family moment, even though I'd been paying the property taxes on that very house for 2 decades. The lawyer looked confused when Michael explained I was just the eldest sister who lived nearby and helped with errands sometimes, his words casually erasing 20 years of financial support, and I watched him hand out documents to everyone but me, explaining how the house value had increased significantly and how they could leverage that equity, never once mentioning who'd been maintaining that value with consistent payments and repairs. My mother sat there nodding along as they discussed selling the house and splitting the proceeds among the successful children who could invest it wisely, and something inside me finally shattered when she said, "Well, we need to make sure the money goes to those who know how to handle it. Not everyone has a head for finances." Looking directly at me with that mixture of pity and condescension I'd swallowed for so long, I set the groceries down quietly, my hands surprisingly steady as I listened to them calculate the house value at $800,000 and debate whether to sell immediately or wait for the market to peak. These same people who'd called me crying when the furnace broke, when the roof leaked, when the mortgage notices arrived, suddenly financial experts planning their windfall from an asset they believed had magically maintained itself. "Katherine, you can go. We'll handle this," Michael said, already dismissing me. And I looked around that room at their excited faces, at the plans they were making with money they assumed was theirs, at my mother already spending her portion on a retirement community near Lisa, and felt 20 years of silence calcifying into something harder, something that had edges and weight and purpose. I left without a word, drove home to my actual residence, which none of them had ever visited, sat at my desk and opened the folder I'd kept for 2 decades, containing every receipt, every bank transfer, every canceled check, every property tax payment, every contractor invoice, every single piece of evidence that the house they were so eager to divide had been floating on my money since the day Dad died, and I finally understood that being invisible had given me the perfect vantage point to document everything while they performed their family charade above the foundation I'd built. The next morning I called in sick for the first time in 5 years and spent the day excavating 20 years of financial archaeology from my files, creating a comprehensive timeline that even surprised me with its scope, calculating that I'd spent roughly $380,000 maintaining their illusion of stability while they performed success for each other and poverty for me, and I felt something shift from hurt to determination as the numbers told their undeniable story. I hired a forensic accountant recommended by a colleague who'd been through a nasty divorce, paying her in cash to analyze everything off the books, and watched her eyes widen as she traced the money flow from my accounts to the house expenses, creating charts that showed how my failure had funded their comfort, how my dead-end job had been their silent life support system, maintaining the very foundation they stood on while calling me unstable. For 3 weeks I continued my usual pattern, showing up with groceries, paying the utility bills before they noticed the late notices, even sitting through Sunday dinner where they discussed their renovation plans for after the sale, and I perfected the art of looking defeated while mentally cataloging every casual cruelty, every dismissive comment, every moment they revealed how little they thought of me, fuel for what was coming. My preparation extended beyond paperwork to understanding property law, and I discovered something beautiful in the legal details my father had left behind, that naming me executor hadn't been the burden they assumed, but a protection he'd built in, requiring my signature for any major decisions regarding the estate, a detail that had seemed meaningless when I was 22, but now glowed with possibility as I realized they couldn't sell without me. I opened a new bank account at a different bank, transferred my savings quietly, and met with my own lawyer who specialized in estate litigation, showing him the receipts and the executor documents, watching him nod as he explained how paying the bills for 20 years had created something called detrimental reliance, how their knowledge and acceptance of my payments had legal implications they'd never considered while they were busy pretending I didn't exist. The hardest part was maintaining the facade, continuing to absorb their casual dismissals while knowing what was in motion, sitting through Lisa's birthday dinner where they forgot to set a place for me until I was already there, listening to Mom tell her book club friend on the phone that at least her other children had given her grandchildren and success to be proud of, watching Michael show off photos from the family cruise they'd taken while I was supposedly working, none of them mentioning I'd handled Mom's bills that month so they could afford it, and I smiled my usual tired smile while mentally reviewing the documentation that would soon flip their entire world upside down. Patient as a spider who'd spent 20 years weaving an invisible web they'd walked through daily without ever noticing the threads. The estate lawyer they'd hired started calling me with increasing frequency as the sale approached, confused by my polite deferrals and requests for documentation, and I could hear the panic creeping into his voice when I mentioned I'd need to review 20 years of property records before signing anything, especially since I'd been handling certain expenses that might complicate the estate's value, a phrase that made him stutter and promise to get back to me after consulting with the family. Michael showed up at my apartment for the first time ever on a Tuesday evening, his face cycling through shock at my actual living situation. A converted loft in the arts district with floor-to-ceiling windows and designer furniture he couldn't quite process belonged to his failure of a sister, and I watched him struggle to reconcile the Katherine he'd invented with the one standing before him in a space that breathed success he'd never bothered to imagine I could achieve. "We need you to sign the papers, Katherine. Stop being difficult about this," he said, trying to summon his usual authoritative tone, but failing as his eyes kept drifting to my wall of professional certifications and the view of the city skyline, and I poured him coffee from my expensive machine, while explaining that as executor, I had a fiduciary duty to ensure all estate matters were properly handled, including a full accounting of expenses over the past 2 decades, watching his jaw tighten as the implications started to dawn. My mother called that night crying, saying I was ruining everything with my selfishness, that I was jealous of my siblings' success and trying to delay their happiness, and I let her words wash over me while I reviewed the forensic accountant's final report showing $387,000 in house-related expenses paid from my accounts, documented down to the penny, a number that would reshape every story they'd told themselves about who carried whom through these 20 years. Lisa tried a different approach, inviting me to lunch at an expensive restaurant I knew she couldn't afford, ordering wine and appetizers while telling me how she'd always defended me to the others, how she knew I'd struggled, but that this was our chance to all move forward, and I nodded along while she painted a future where I'd get my fair share of the sale, maybe enough for a down payment on a small condo, never once acknowledging that I'd already been paying for the house we were discussing. The turning point came when their lawyer sent a formal letter threatening legal action if I continued to obstruct the sale, a beautifully worded piece of intimidation that my own lawyer found hilarious, especially the part about my bad faith delay of family assets, and we crafted a response that included just enough detail about documented expenses and executor rights to make them realize they'd badly miscalculated, that their invisible sister had been keeping receipts in more ways than one, that 20 years of pretending I didn't exist had given me the perfect cover to build a case they never saw coming, and I felt the ground shifting beneath their feet while I stood steady on foundation I'd built dollar by dollar, payment by payment, in silence and shadows they'd created but never thought to illuminate. The family meeting they called for that Sunday was meant to be an intervention, but it became my revelation when I walked into the living room carrying a single manila folder and a laptop, my hands steady with the kind of calm that comes from knowing you hold all the cards, and I watched their faces shift from condescension to confusion as I set up my presentation on the TV they'd bought with money I'd saved them, preparing to show them exactly who they'd been calling a failure for 20 years. "Before you say anything," I began, my voice carrying a strength they'd never heard before, "I want to show you some numbers," and I clicked through the forensic accountant's report while their mouths fell open at the sight of 20 years of bank transfers, mortgage payments, property taxes, utility bills, repair costs, insurance premiums. Every single dollar I'd spent maintaining their illusion tallied with receipts they couldn't deny, culminating in that beautiful total that made their jaws drop that hung in the air like a verdict. My mother tried to speak, but I kept going, showing them the executor documents that gave me final say over any sale, the legal opinion stating that my financial contributions created an equitable interest in the property, the detrimental reliance claim that would freeze any transaction until my contributions were addressed, and I watched Michael's business acumen crumble as he realized his failure of a sister had built an ironclad case while he'd been too busy dismissing her to notice. "You can't do this to family," Lisa whispered, tears forming as she calculated what this meant for her plans. But I laughed, actually laughed, and pulled up the screenshots I'd taken over the years, family vacations I'd funded but wasn't invited to, renovation posts claiming Michael's generosity when I'd paid every contractor, Mother's Day brunches at expensive restaurants while I sat home after covering Mom's medical bills, 20 years of being erased from the narrative of the very life I'd been financing. The real shock came when I revealed my actual financial situation. My investment portfolio that had grown while they spent freely believing their safety net would always exist. My salary that had quietly climbed into 6 figures while they mocked my corporate job. The inheritance from Dad's life insurance that I'd invested instead of spent, because I'd learned early that family would take everything if you let them see it. And I watched them recalculate every dismissive comment they'd made about their pathetic sister who couldn't even afford to join them for dinner. "I'm not blocking the sale," I said finally, closing my laptop with the satisfaction of someone who'd waited 2 decades for this moment. "But my lawyer will ensure that my documented contributions is deducted from the proceeds before any distribution, which leaves significantly less than you were planning on. And yes, I'll be signing off on the sale because unlike what you've told yourselves for 20 years, I'm not here to support you anymore." And I stood to leave while they sat in stunned silence. Their family meeting turned into a reckoning they never saw coming. My phone exploded with calls and texts as I drove away, but I'd already blocked their numbers and instructed my lawyer to handle all communication going forward, because after 20 years of being their invisible foundation, I was done being anything to them at all. And the freedom felt like breathing clearly for the first time since Dad died, and left me holding everyone else's life together while they pretended I didn't exist. 6 months later, I'm sitting in my actual home office, the one they never knew existed, watching the sunset paint the city in shades of gold while my bank account reflects the settlement reflecting every penny I'd spent that arrived last week, and I realize the money itself matters less than what it represents. Vindication for every dismissive comment, every forgotten invitation. Every moment they made me feel like I was worth less than the bills I paid to keep their illusion alive. The house sold for $750,000 after my deduction, leaving them with far less than they'd dreamed about, and I heard through mutual acquaintances that Michael had to sell one of his dealerships, that Lisa's surgeon husband wasn't as understanding about the reduced windfall as she'd hoped, that Mom had to settle for a modest senior living apartment instead of the luxury retirement community she'd already been bragging about to her church friends, and I felt no satisfaction in their struggles, just a clean emptiness where obligation used to live. I've stopped checking their social media, stopped wondering if they ever understood what they lost when they decided I was worth less than visible success, and instead I focus on the life I've built in their shadows, the friendships with people who see me, the career that flourished while they weren't watching, the peace that comes from no longer hemorrhaging money into a black hole of familial dysfunction disguised as duty. Sometimes I think about Dad and wonder if he knew what he was doing when he named me executor, if he saw how things would unfold and tried to protect me the only way he could, by giving me a legal voice they couldn't silence completely, and I choose to believe he did. That somewhere in those final conversations, he recognized which child would hold the family together, even if that family would never acknowledge it until forced to see the receipts. And I honor his memory not by continuing his pattern but by breaking it. By choosing myself after 20 years of choosing them. By understanding that sometimes the greatest inheritance a parent can leave is the strength to finally walk away.